I seen a jazz funeral last from Friday to Monday morning. The wake started Friday night, Saturday night, and then Monday morning. Yeah. Everybody got along, hang around, have a good time, eat and drink.
I remember reading somewhere where you cry at the birth and rejoice at the death because you're going someplace forever to a glory. These people were being sent off with a band, and everybody was being joyous about it.
You'd be sorry when the baby's born because it's coming in to trials and tribulation, and you're supposed to rejoice when it leaves because everything's all over. You owe somebody some money. When you lay down, it's all over. That's their problem.
The Bible tells, God tells, make a joyful noise, and the ministers have to help the people. And if this is what they want, this is what we get.
I think it's very spiritual, first of all, because when we're on our way to bring the body to the grave, it's like, you know, it's very emotional thing, you know. But after they drop the body and they give thanks and praise to the Most High God, you know, it's time to move on and be happy. And the trumpets and the sound that the horns give, you know, rejoicing. If you really listen, you really feel it, you know. I heard someone describe it as I was looking from a distance and I saw a massive crowd with instruments, you know, coming toward me. And then all of a sudden I became a part of that. And then I found myself lost somewhere.
New Orleans is a city that likes to celebrate, but we don't just celebrate life, we celebrate death by honoring our loved ones in a very special way. Hello, my name is Milton Batiste. I'm lead trumpet player, manager of DeJohn's Olympia Brass Band. Now join me as I give you a closer look at New Orleans jazz funerals from the inside. A traditional jazz funeral is made up of two major parts. First, the band meets at the funeral home or the church where the services are being held. From there, the procession travels through the neighborhood to the cemetery. The band provides musical accompaniments with hymns such as Flee as a Bird, or Just a Closer Walk with Thee. The tone is solemn, and there is very little improvisation. If the cemetery is too far away, you might just travel a few blocks.
I don't care how far the graveyard was. We had to walk to the graveyard them days. Right now, sometimes we walk about 6 or 8 blocks, you know. And them days we walked to the graveyard. The funeral lasts both all day sometime.
It don't faze me, 'cause I love to play music. I can play all day long, never get tired. Never get tired.
As the procession heads through the neighborhood, you might see a black memorial wreath hanging on the door where the deceased lived or worked. Before reaching the cemetery, we have a ceremony called Cutting the Body Loose. The band, the family, and friends stand on the side of the street as the hearse passes through and proceeds into the cemetery for final services. After the services, we played taps. If the deceased was in the military, we play the blues if he was a blues man. When the services are finished, the second part begins. Once we've left the cemetery and walked a respectable distance away, the cadence of the drum changes and we start playing up-tempo dance music, like When the Saints Go Marching In, or Disney Ramble, or maybe Bourbon Street Parade.
The route may actually be determined by what watering holes members of the entourage feel like visiting in the afternoon. And certainly the character of the procession changes after they've been to a few of these bars. The musicians certainly are not above imbibing a little bit, and maybe the character of the music is also going to be affected by that as well. But that's part of the whole process. It's part of the celebration in New Orleans, you know, that the wine flows freely.
Leading the parade is a grand marshal who might be a band member, a part of a social or benevolent club in which the deceased was a member. Harold Dudley is the grand marshal for the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club. A member since 1973, Dudley leads the Zulu parade every year on Mardi Gras Day. One of the duties of a grand marshal is to make the arrangements for the jazz funeral whenever one of the Zulu members passes away. Once the funeral begins, he calls for the music and leads the procession along through the route.
The marshal is calling the shots, and he has to know what he's doing. Now, if he can't maneuver with the music, he can throw the band off. Just like a majorette, a drum major. You know, they got to have that tempo, you know, that move. See, now all marshals don't have that.
A lot of people look at Grand Marshal just for dancing, but it's a job, and he has his role. And if he doesn't play his role, the program doesn't go right. So it's very important.
I've often seen him as a kind of barometer of what's going on, because you really run a kind of spectrum of emotions with a brass band funeral. I mean, you're supposed to go from despair to joy, essentially. And to some extent, the marshal is sort of like keeping the reins on and kind of regulating the emotion and the intensity of what's going on. So to me, that's the role that he plays. And sometimes you want someone to show the dignity. Sometimes you want someone who can really move on their feet.
I've been around so long, I hear music, here I come.
Along the way, people from the neighborhood join in the parade, causing it to grow in size and intensity. These people are called the second line.
The jazz funeral is very effective, and a lot of people don't like them because of the second line.
Well, the second line has really become a very elastic and ambiguous term because it's used to describe rhythms, it's used to describe dancing, but what it really means is the uninvited guests that everybody expects to show up.
That's what it is. That's what it really is, uninvited guests.
So the first line are the members of the Benevolent Association, and their invited guests, family members, and the brass band are paid to be there. But after they've left the cemetery, kids and people of all ages really spill out from the neighborhoods, and they become the sort of tail on the snake. And this is what really gives the whole procession its character from the jazz point of view. Things get very wild with the dancing, which is extremely flamboyant and wild, and is meant to really sort of cover the gamut of life's emotions and experiences.
There are some churches does reject to it, but we have never reject to it because, for one thing, the second line and all of them, they always stay outside. They never come into the church, you see.
one of the most distinguishing features of the jazz funeral, we believe, is the second line, the way the neighborhood responds to the procession, comes out, the kind of body language you see in the dancing, the way, the reciprocity that exists between the second line and the musicians in the brass band. We think this is one of the distinctive and unique features of the New Orleans jazz funeral.
It's participatory. It's a participatory culture. We maintained a pedestrian culture in New Orleans. That's another traditional thing. The interstate system came here late, and so if you're a pedestrian society, then you're more apt to getting on your feet and getting out to do something when you hear music going by is more likely than if you're in a society that the only time you leave your house you get in your car to go somewhere.
The second line is really the people that follow the funeral. You know, you used to walk on the sidewalk in second line with the band, but now people all in the street in between the band and everything. You know, I guess if some people forget there was at a funeral. You know? Yeah.
Sometimes we feed off the crowd. Okay, even though it's a jazz funeral for that particular person and his or her family, but you get so used to the crowd, and sometimes some of the familiar faces that's always around the jazz funeral or second line beat, you know, and it's like, yeah, so-and-so's out here, so we gonna roll, we have a good time. You know, even though it's a jazz funeral, yeah, we gonna have a good time, you know, yeah.
This is a way of showing respect. It's community involvement is really what the second line is all about.
We had one lady down here a couple years back that seen a jazz funeral for the first time, and she was amazed about how they danced along with the parade. So they was very, you know, they be very excited about it.
A lot of people come here, they have heard about a jazz funeral, but have never seen one. And when they do get to see one, they go wild over it. Because they say they can't believe it. Somebody's, you know, is deceased and gone, and they're laughing and drinking beer and whatnot. They figure that you're supposed to be sad. And like, if I go back to what I was telling you, that's where the joy come in.
And who do you have to be to get a jazz funeral?
Well, I think it's been said that anyone who can pay for it will get one. But I think, certainly in the case of many jazz musicians, those who have earned the right, I think this is where a lot of the attention is focused. Someone like Danny Barker or Willie Humphrey.
Today, when people see a jazz funeral, they usually assume it's for a musician. But that's not always the case. And when we look back to the origins of the ritual, we'll see that the deceased's occupation had little or nothing to do with it. There's really no clear-cut date as to when the jazz funerals began in New Orleans.
To tell you the truth, I don't know where it originated, but I found it there when I come here. I found it here 86 years ago. Yeah.
Obviously, the first funeral where the band played jazz music would have occurred after jazz came on the scene. But the ritual of playing sad music on the way to the cemetery and happy music afterwards was around long before jazz. Consequently, historians prefer to call them something else.
We don't call jazz funerals. We always call them brass band funerals.
It's really a funeral with music, and the music just happens to be jazz.
Actually, the term jazz funerals became commonly used in the late 50s or the early 60s. But funerals with jazz music have been held in New Orleans since the early 20th century. Brass band funerals, or funerals with music, were around long before that, and not just in New Orleans.
The origins of jazz funerals I'd still prefer to call, I would prefer also to call them funerals with music, would be in the various folk cultures of And on other cultures, just it seems to go back to antiquity. I mean, there's people forever had, way back as far as you go, seem to have had funerals with music. And so the idea that the funeral as a sort of a combination solemn and joyous occasion fits in with the concept of Christianity and a lot of other religious things.
You're probably going to find Italian religious processions accompanying funerals in Sicily, in Romania, for example. There are brass bands that play for funerals and weddings. Certainly the Irish wake is world famous, and in African societies there has traditionally been music and dancing with virtually all aspects of life, including dying.
Today, funerals with music exist almost exclusively in New Orleans, but in the 19th century, they were held throughout the United States. Originally, they were tied to groups called friendly organizations or benevolent societies, which were established to help former slaves and immigrants when they came to America. They provided benefits such as doctor services, annuities for widows, and education funds for orphans.
They were organizations that were put together to do, among other things, provide insurance. And the burial societies were specifically put together for burials, and that was one of the main things that were done, burial societies, these friendly organizations.
This is part of the broad immigrant experience. Germans, Irish, Italians all have benevolent associations when they were getting situated. In the cases of African Americans, they're not getting situated and quite often until after the Civil War and emancipation. And so there's like a lag in their experience. They've been in the country for a long time, but their status changes with the Emancipation Proclamation. So following the Civil War, they need to sort of build themselves from the ground up. And social services that would have been provided to other aspects of the community were denied to African Americans. And so the Benevolent Association becomes the means for self-help, particularly when it comes to health insurance or a proper burial. This was the only recourse available to this population.
Many of these benevolent societies had brass bands. They played for various functions, parties, weddings, and of course, funerals.
The Benevolent Society had that burial polish for 25 cents a week, you know, and if they wanted a band, they give them a band. If the widow wanted the money, you give her the money. Olympia had a Benevolent Society, and the club they called the Vidalias, and Jean's Amis, Sanders Sinners, and the Tulane Club. Well, I remember playing funerals for all of them.
This is going on before jazz funerals, we think. There's a funeral with music, and this is what you get for your weekly or monthly dues. Some people say it was a quarter a week or a nickel a week, but it adds up, and what you get is a proper send-off, which would mean a brass band accompanying you.
While funerals with music began disappearing elsewhere in the U.S., before the turn of the century, they thrived in New Orleans. In an article published in 1885, a reporter for Harper's Weekly wrote about the old primitive funeral fashions in New Orleans, where almost everybody is buried with a brass band. And that on a return from the funerals, the streets are enlivened with cheerful music.
It was originally in New Orleans not just black bands at black funerals, but it was bands at all funerals. And Jack Lane, an old white band leader who died at age 90-something in the middle 1960s, and in interviews said that the music with white funerals for these burial societies seems to have died out around 1904. And I guess it just became something that people thought was old-fashioned and abandoned it. But the black groups continued it.
Well, we still have a lot of information to be found about where the jazz funeral comes from. But the best thinking today focuses on the Bolden Band, the Lane Band, and various dance bands that would also, say, double for music in the streets, and the impact they had in changing market conditions in the city for hotter, more dance-oriented music, more syncopated music, more improvisational music. So that bands that, say, were in place by the turn of the century, black marching bands like the Onward or the Excelsior, whereas in the 1890s they are probably playing funerals with hymns being read as written by the period 1903-1905, which is also the heyday of Bolden's popularity. They're beginning to loosen up rhythmically, they're beginning to improvise more, they're beginning to fake, in other words, responding to these changing market conditions. And that's probably where the jazz funeral comes in. So the jazz funeral is part of a longer tradition, which was perhaps originally more polite and then gets funkier when jazz begins to attract more notoriety in the New Orleans area.
Pinning down an exact date for the birth of jazz is a difficult task. The first commercially successful jazz recording was in 1917, but most scholars would place it sometime between 1895 and 1916.
Well, I never knew nothing about jazz.
Well, ragtime.
Ragtime's all I knew about ragtime until these fellas went north, and then they called it jazz.
Do you feel there's any difference between ragtime and jazz?
Not very much. Not very much.
There's various musics that lead up to jazz, and it's not so much a revolution as an evolution, so you can see the music taking on more and more of the characteristics that become jazz as it gets closer and closer to this 1916 date. The earlier bands would have been ragtime funerals as opposed to New Orleans ragtime funerals as opposed to New Orleans jazz funerals. And so, in my estimation, if Jack Lane said the white bands with music, or the white funerals with music stopped being around 1904 or 1905, then technically the first funerals with jazz would have probably been played at the black funerals.
So the jazz funeral is really a vestige of an older tradition combined with a style of music that is rooted in New Orleans. Though the ritual virtually disappeared around the nation, the black community in New Orleans embraced it.
One of the ways in which the black population made its presence felt, its visibility was often tied to the processions in the streets of black brass bands. And so in their uniforms, these are role models, they're sending a very important message across. So to some extent, the brass bands are the arm of the Benevolent Association saying, here we are, we're in the streets, we're in the city, we're a part of this community, we belong here. And I think that's really part of the message of the brass band funeral, which becomes the jazz funeral. It's cultural pride, it's community spirit, all wrapped up into a nice musical package.
Brass bands flourished from the 1880s through the 1920s, but the Depression nearly caused them to die out altogether. Many of the benevolent societies also began to fade away as insurance companies made them obsolete, though some still exist today as social clubs. In the white communities, funerals with music were practically non-existent. When Huey Long died in 1939, his funeral was probably the largest in Louisiana history.
The funeral of the Kingfish on the lawn of the State House in Baton Rouge was a major event, with thousands upon thousands of friends and foes in the crush of humanity.
There was no brass band accompanying his hearse to the cemetery, and if anyone celebrated after he was buried, it was probably in private. Though taste in music changed and demand for brass bands declined, jazz funerals survived through the 30s and the 40s in the New Orleans black community, although there was an obstacle.
The only one that stopped jazz funerals around the 30s, around the third as far as I was a Catholic church. We couldn't have no jazz funerals at a Catholic church. But then I guess they got wise and started letting us play the funerals again. Because I have played 3 funerals a day. I remember playing 3 funerals a day.
By the late 40s, tourists began to notice the quaint tradition. This cartoon is from a 1950 issue of Record Changer, a monthly jazz magazine published in England. The caption reads, "Man, I had a ball in New Orleans. 5 funerals."
By the 1950s, you're seeing something of a resuscitation. You've got the Gibson Brass Band. Henry Allen's Algiers Brass Band is still going strong. The Young Tuxedo emerges there, and probably the most important of the bands from the early 60s was the Eureka.
There was a self-conscious revival of the black funerals and the black brass band, too, which Danny Barker and other people participated in and saw it as a dying tradition that needed to be rescued. So it's a tradition that may have in fact died if it hadn't been re-nurtured and re-established.
Since then, funerals with music have been held almost exclusively in New Orleans. But there have been exceptions. For example, in 1958, blues legend W.C. Handy was given a funeral with music in New York City.
The cortege leaves the church. An estimated 150,000 line the streets. His death at the age of 84 marks the end of a man, perhaps the passing of an era. But without doubt, there survives the legacy of the music of, in the words of the eulogy, an apostle of happiness, W.C. Handy.
One person who contributed greatly to preserving the images of funerals is former WDSU news photographer Don Perry.
One of the nicest funerals I saw, but I didn't photograph, was a funeral with John Casimir, and it was up in Jefferson somewhere. It was along River Road, and we were up on the levee, and we looked down, and we could see this funeral going by. It was just so beautiful. And I think that's kind of the thing that started me wanting to shoot funerals, because it was such a beautiful thing. They were walking under trees, there was shade and everything. It was just beautiful. We just liked the music, and we thought it should be preserved. And during the 60s, when I was working at the station, decided I had access, I could buy film, and we were doing our own processing at the station, so I could do things at about half my cost. So I would go out and shoot film, buy a couple rolls of film, go out and shoot some stuff. And I used to say, I'll shoot anything that plays jazz. But I just loved the music, and of course a lot of these people I knew. They were friends of mine.
But even as the tradition was nurtured and preserved, it continued to struggle for survival in modern times. Older musicians were passing away, and musical styles continued to evolve.
It's been like a roller coaster ride since the 1950s and 60s, because we see sort of peaks and valleys going on. It's really kind of hard to keep track of all of it. We know one major turning point came in the mid-1970s with Danny Barker's Fairview Baptist Church bands, and that a lot of the younger players then have turned into some of the major forces in brass bands today, like Dr. Michael White and Greg Stafford and Freddie Lonzo and others. Also, the Olympia Brass Band has really been a kind of element of continuity for the last 3 decades or so. And this is, I think, worldwide, probably one of the most famous of all New Orleans brass bands, and one which in many cases brought the tradition to the international audience for the first time. Most of the bands that preceded them were much more obscure than the Olympia have been.
Now, I've been in Dejon's Olympia Brass Band for over 3 decades, but the original band was started in the year of 1883. Like many other brass bands, they were all gone during World War II. But in 1955, Harold Duke Dejean revived the band, and he called it Dejean's Olympia Brass Band.
I used to play with the Olympia Serenaders when I was about 15 years old. And I thought about all that good music we was playing, and I really liked to play the music because it's really beautiful music, as you know.
Harold certainly had the credentials to start a traditional New Orleans brass band.
When I got old enough to play, you know, around 12, 14 years old, I played funeral with whatever brass band I had, you know, like the Shawnee Lee's brass band, the San Jacinto's brass band, Holy Ghost brass band, the Eureka brass band, Johnny Cashman's brass bands, Celestine brass band. I played all them bands.
Besides funerals, the band played for all sorts of celebrations, including Mardi Gras. When he formed the band, Harold wanted to make sure it maintained the traditional sound and the look that brass bands had before the Depression.
I think the first set of uniforms, I picked them out because I wanted the band to have the real brass band uniform. The old-time brass band uniforms, caps and everything.
Besides the uniforms, another distinctive feature of New Orleans brass bands is the wire hoop used to play the cymbal on the bass drum.
First time I heard jazz was about, I was about 3 years old, so that would be about 1930 or 31. And I just remember being fascinated by the drumming. I remember the drummer had a cymbal on his drum, and they still do it. And I thought it was a coat hanger that he was using to play the cymbal. And that's always stuck in my mind. But I was very impressed by it.
Olympia's bass drummer, Noel Papa Glass, uses the wire hoop as did his father, Henry Booker T. Glass.
My daddy made that himself. It was his idea. He made it out of clotheslines. And so he took me that and heated and bent it like he wanted. Now everyone is doing it.
Before joining Olympia, Papa and his father played with another band in New Orleans.
I played snare drum with the Eureka Brass Band, and my dad played bass drum with the Eureka Brass Band, side by side, him and I. We played side by side. We used to play for the Young and True Friends funerals, you know. That's where I really learned how to start playing funerals, playing the Eureka.
When Booker T had taken ill and could no longer carry the bass drum in a marching band, Harold needed a new bass drummer. Papa stepped in. His father became Olympia's Grand Marshal.
I used to follow Dejean and them playing my snare drum anyhow, and watch everything my dad would do. That's how I learned how to play bass drum. So Harold said, no, man, we need a bass drum player. I said, well, I'll play the bass drum. He said, you think you'll handle it? I said, yes. So I started playing bass drum with the band. And my dad was Grand Marshal. They put him Grand Marshal. And so I've been playing bass drum ever since. About 30 years, wasn't 32 years. Now I've been in the band older than any man in the band, the Olympia Brass Band. After a while, I'll be catching with Mr. Dejean. Yeah, because, you know, I've been, after my dad, I was the oldest man in the band.
Booker T. Glass performed as Grand Marshal with Olympia for many years. Even with failing eyesight and deterioration of health, he continued until he died in 1982 at age 91 while making a commercial with the band. Probably the most famous Grand Marshal with Olympia was Matthew Fat Houston.
Fat Houston was the man, yeah. Fat Houston was fat, and he could Grand Marshal.
Today, the band's Grand Marshal is Richard King Matthews. Olympia has performed in concerts and parades all over the world.
I made about 28 European trips with the band. We're going back over again.
Since this band been organized, I never surprised to go nowhere. Thought I was going to Russia one time. You know? Yeah.
Though the band has played abroad, most, but not all of our jazz funerals have been in New Orleans. In 1990, we got a call from a Welshman who had become a millionaire in the United States. He had seen a video of one of our jazz funerals and called us to make the arrangements for his own jazz funeral. Money was no object. A year later, he passed away, and soon we found ourselves in a little village in Wales called Portsmouth.
We're in the country of Wales, but the name of the town, I can't pronounce it. I couldn't pronounce it when I read it in the paper.
The people weren't sure how they should respond to us, but on the first night, we performed at the wake, and they cut loose immediately.
The people act just like they're in New Orleans. They dance like they're in New Orleans. They drink like they're in New Orleans. They do everything.
I didn't expect them to start dancing right away, you know, really. They lit it in on the first tune, man. That was great, though. To see people enjoy it. We had a lady at the bar just a while ago. She said, you know, y'all moved me. And that's hard for me to get moved.
On that day in Portsmouth, Wales, the funeral was the talk of the town.
It's changed my view of having a funeral. I don't know whether you have lots in America, do you?
It's not a bit like a Welsh funeral, that's for sure. And it's the jolliness of it all. Because we've all got to go sometime. You may as well go with a smile.
Yeah. It was very unusual. We've never seen anything like it before here. And I don't think we'll ever see it again.
It's strange to think that someone that started out in Wales had, you know, spent their lifetime in America and had a different outlook on funerals in the end. It's very nice.
Everything is lovely. Lovely, lovely people. It's like the people in New Orleans that enjoy this music. Yeah. And all over the world. You know? Not only New Orleans, all over the world.
Olympia has played hundreds of jazz funerals, both large and small. The size of the funeral may depend on the weather or the time of the day, but mostly it depends on who's being buried.
Biggest funeral I could remember offhand was Alphonse Picou, then Paul Barbaran, then Celestin's funeral. That's the three biggest funerals I remember.
The larger ones tend to be for fellow musicians, and quite often the band plays for free.
I played many jobs free from Milton and Howard. Just following them. Just following them, yeah.
Well, if you play for some musician, a friend of ours, you know, we don't get paid, you know, unless somebody nice enough to pay for it, you know. You know. Sometimes somebody says, I'm going to pay for the funeral. Well, that's nice. Yeah.
But you don't have to be a musician to get a proper send-off. You just have to be able to pay for it. In the old days, the benevolent societies paid for the band.
When I come up playing, they had the benevolent societies where they got a band for $25, $30 that time, you know. For the price it was paying.
I had played funeral with the Eureka Band. We walked from the cutoff to Algiers, which is 5 miles, for $6. And we get ready to get the $6, we ain't got nothing. Because to stay so long in the church, be hot, we then drink up the $6 for either the spending or something to eat. Be 3, 4 o'clock in the evening before we get to the cemetery. $6 is all we used to get for a funeral. $6.
One reason why Olympia has survived over the years is because we have alternate members. This makes it possible to put a 10 or 12-piece band together on brief notice. And as our musicians get older, we continue to add younger musicians that want to keep the tradition alive.
If I die, hire somebody in my place. You know, that's the way the ball bounces.
In recent years, many young New Orleans musicians have been interested in playing traditional jazz, and many new bands have been formed. There are more brass bands now than there have been in years.
When I was coming up, we didn't have as many brass bands as there are now. There were only a few brass bands, and they're much older guys. So as opposed to today, you have brass bands coming up everywhere.
Now, kids are walking down the streets with instruments, not even in cases, picking up numbers. They try to play Bourbon Street, Basin Street. You know, I listen to a lot of cats, you know, them little youngsters. They actually are doing it now. But at one time, that was unheard of. And so now, it's just all of a sudden just been like a big wind and change, and everybody woke up, and there's a lot of trombone players, there's a lot of drummers, tubas for days.
Now, it's almost easy for a kid to come along with an instrument and say, well, I want to do this. Maybe he doesn't know how to play, but the fact that he want to come out there and give it a shot, you know. Like you said, we're looking at a kid keeping the tradition going as he grows older.
Over the years, I've worked with many young musicians. This band was called Olympia Junior. They actually played several jobs with the band and learned how to play jazz funerals from us. Though the band no longer exists, many of the musicians play in other brass bands around the city. Today, a new band, the Young Olympians, are following in Olympia Brass Band's footsteps.
We're definitely traditional. Matter of fact, we're patting ourselves behind the Olympia Brass Band. So, you know, there's like 90% traditional music. You know, they play a little other than traditional, but 99% of the music is traditional. So by us patting ourselves behind them, it's just like falling in sequence. We have to just, not have to, but we do play a lot of traditional music.
But like any kid learning to play an instrument, they soon start adding their favorite new music to the mix. Keeping the traditional music intact becomes quite a challenge.
A lot of young groups coming up now is going strictly new wave, funk, whatever you want to call it. You know, but they don't know that the most important, you know, part of any program is the foundation, and the most important part of New Orleans jazz music is the traditional music.
The music at funerals that I've heard, seen recently, is very different from the music that I saw at funerals in the 1950s, and different from the 1960s and 70s. It's always changing. It's changing. It's got more rap in it now than it had. And a few years ago, it had more rhythm and blues in it than it had. And if you listen in the 50s, it was still a much more of a pure jazz brass band than it is now.
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of variance, and this is one of the more controversial issues, is that many people are sort of committed to the traditional ritual, and what we see happening today is that these traditions are changing. In the hands of the younger generation, there are what are considered oftentimes to be liberties taken with the ritual, and so in many cases, even before the body is cut loose, you're going to have some hot music, and you're going to have a second line happening really from the beginning of the procession.
So the tradition has changed to being into a party from the get-go now.
When you're talking about changing traditions, I think a good case in point is when the jazz funeral emerges. That originally the brass bands like the Onward and the Excelsior were strict reading bands. And so we have a parallel between what's happening today and what happened at the dawn of the jazz funeral. All this faking and non-reading and improvisation and sort of increased syncopation and rhythmic flexibility that go into the jazz funeral were probably pretty shocking to the proponents of the more traditional, staid, read it as written kind of musical accompaniment for funerals.
It's a funeral with music, and what you play at the funeral, on the way back especially, would be the most up-to-date, hilarious, joyful music that you could think of that expressed the culture. And so at any given point, this music would be changing and getting more modern, as it's doing continually today.
when you pass the torch on to the younger generation, they're going to do what they want with it. But I think that this is to be expected. That's what cultural change is all about. You can't really predict where it's going to go.
I wish that not only Milton, but the other older guys get a grasp of the younger guys like myself. And because at the same time, I'm starting to get a grasp of younger guys than I am, because I can see the decline, you know. And not only jazz funerals, but the tradition, the music itself.
I'm very grateful from it start so early in the jazz funerals at a very young age. So I hope that even after I get older, maybe in my 40s or 50s or 80s or 90s, whatever, that it'll still go on and exist, you know, as, you know, from what I'm contributing to it. Because I think it's a beautiful thing that shouldn't die.
New Orleans is like a living history book, and the jazz funeral is a very important chapter. So we'll just keep turning each page by celebrating life from the beginning to the end.
It's an honor to them. They can't hear it, but it's an honor. If I die and don't have a jazz funeral, I think I'll come back with my stick and get it.
If something was to happen to me, it would be a rare case for Zulu not to, you know, because they don't want to participate in the jazz funeral for me. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, they're gonna, so they got a bunch of them in there waiting. You know, when you're dead, you're done. But as many, I'm not only talking about Charlie Bunch, Drew, many people, guys that I done, well, we said bring them down, that I done brought down. Yeah, I really think somebody's gonna be there with a, if it don't be nothing but a harmonica.
Jazz funeral is people, and if this is their life, well, you have to go by what the people want.
The only negative I get out of a jazz funeral is the person passing away. You know, sometimes I wonder, I wish we hadn't have to have someone to die in order to have a jazz funeral.
I've always thought of funerals as being given as a respect for the dead and comfort for the living. And so I guess it just takes this, and the funeral in New Orleans with music just takes that to the New Orleans way of doing it.
It's a spiritual thing, I believe. Maybe when we get to heaven, I can maybe tell you about it, because I asked the question.